Good afternoon and welcome to the second session of our Always On virtual series. This virtual series is designed to provide you with thought leadership throughout the year and provide a deep dive into the trends that are transforming the way we do business. During each session, we will be joined by Carousel's own Chief Technology Officer, Jason Vieira, who will identify the right mix of topics and speakers to advance your IT strategy and enlighten you on hot-button issues and industry trends. Today, we are joined by Principal Consultant, John Elliott, to discuss why SD-WAN is taking over the industry. At the end of today's session, John and Jason will address your questions. Please use the Q&A function below the presentation to submit any questions you would like to ask our presenters. With that, John, I'll leave it to you.
Hello, thank you and welcome everyone. I'm going to go right into this to avoid any delays. Thank you for showing up and showing up on time. We'll be talking about SD-WAN today and how it's really changing the industry from a wide area perspective in the last year or two and moving forward. So before I go into that, we'll do a quick introduction of Carousel. Obviously, we'll talk a little bit about SD-WAN, set a baseline for those of you that may be a little less familiar with it. Talk a little bit about where we're headed as an industry, where we've come from, and some of the changes going on right now, and how we might be able to help you in deploying or managing or procuring some of these products or services as time goes along. So again, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this, so we'll dive into SD-WAN in just a moment, so just bear with me for patience. For those of you that don't know, though, I do want to do a quick background on Carousel. We are a nationwide company of over 6,000 clients. We've been in business for several decades, more than 2 decades at this point. Offices throughout the country and some international locations as well. So wide breadth of support, able to do business in a large number of countries as well. So the other thing that we do is that we have a fairly broad breadth of technology, and I'm going to repeat this at least once, but just to kind of re-emphasizing, or to emphasize it, we can obviously procure equipment for you. We can procure services from carriers. We can design a solution, we can install a solution, we can manage a solution as we go along here. And this, I think, becomes particularly important with new technologies where often we might be doing a deployment or even management of the technology for the first year or so as you become familiar with how it operates and what the capabilities of a particular solution are. So again, full breadth of services, regardless of what you need, it's something that we can probably provide. There are a couple of approaches that we have here, and when we talk about SD-WAN here, usually most people think about it as a customer premise equipment that gets put on your location, but SD-WAN is one of those things where it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Depending on who you ask, you'll get a different definition. And that is one thing, that we have a full breadth of services and providers. So whether you're talking about let's say a carrier provided service where you're going to a carrier and you have one bill, one person to talk to, one thing that you're dealing with, or whether you want more of an agnostic solution where you get to pick the carrier and the transport and a lot of advantages in that regard when it comes to SD-WAN. It's something that we can deliver, we can design, we can deploy it, we can manage it. So again, that was a little bit on Carousel. Certainly if your local account team can help you out, understand what our capabilities are, what we can do for you, and how we can help you. But with that, I'm going to dive right into SD-WAN, and as mentioned before at the top, if you have any questions, there is the question dialogue. Feel free to ask them. I will actually try to, maybe not the instant you put it in, but we might mix them in and answer some of the questions if they're short answers during the presentation, if they're relevant to that particular subject, and we might do some of it at the end. But feel free to please put the questions in as they come to mind before you have a chance to forget them at least, and we'll try to address as many as we can before we wrap up at the end of this. So talking about SD-WAN as a technology, a little bit of background here. There's a lot of hype around this, and it's the magical thing that solves all the problems. It costs less, it gives you more bandwidth, it can help you get to the cloud better, it makes your security better, it gives you better control. And at a high level, most of these things can be true. Now, having said all this, you don't always get all of these things all the time. It depends on your specific use case. A lot of the savings and bandwidth optimization from SD-WAN actually might come from taking a traditional MPLS type solution where you're paying a fairly significant amount for an SLA and replacing that with multiple internets that are cheaper and faster, or both, cheaper or faster, or cheaper and faster. And using SD-WAN to essentially provide that SLA for you by choosing between the carriers that are providing the optimal path at a given time. So the other things that it might give you is visibility and control, the ability to go to one place everywhere in your environment and not only see what's happening in your network, but potentially control what happens in your network. So again, the need for this will depend a lot depending on who you are and the industry that you're part of. If you are in a regulated industry or you have third-party audit compliance concerns such as PCI standards or maybe even HIPAA, where you need to be able to validate where certain data or certain networks are going, the ability to go to one place and audit that in one simple location as opposed to having to validate maybe several hundred devices with dozens of interfaces spread all over the country or the world could be the advantage for you. So again, a lot of different ways to do this, a lot of things that might be an advantage, and most of these are going to be unique to your particular situation. Some things that are care about for parts of the audience are not going to be care about for other parts of the audience. You might be interested in the cost savings. You might be interested in getting more bandwidth. You might be interested in, the one thing I haven't mentioned here is the ability to be transport agnostic and bring a location up quickly. Because I'm transport agnostic, with SD-WAN I can throw in an LTE connection or some sort of cellular connection. I can go out to a remote location, and if I have power and I have a cell signal, I can be up and running on the network, often the same day, right? Compare that with a traditional carrier type offering where I might have to go out and have a build out where it might take weeks, in some cases months, to get a circuit out to a new location that I want to bring online. So again, a lot of different advantages, a lot of ways that it could help you. But jumping backwards a little bit, we talked a lot about a lot of the advantages. If we talk about where we are today historically with traditional networks, you're probably familiar with it, traditional routers spread out everywhere, distributed control. It's actually kind of a, if anyone's ever worked with distributed databases, the idea of routing protocols, keeping route tables synchronized across a wide area is actually a kind of a marvel of engineering, but it also required quite a bit of expertise to manage and do well. And when you got into these more complex scenarios that we're going to talk about with SD-WAN, where you might want to have some traffic go over, let's say, an MPLS provider and some traffic go over, let's say, an internet circuit, you wanted to make sure that internet circuit was secure using, encryption. All of these things were pretty hard to do. And when you did them, if you had 100 locations, you had to do them 100 times. So it became very painful to do these kinds of advanced solutions in an environment. And what ends up happening in most environments is that these solutions are never deployed. So there may be a business need that never fully gets addressed. It may impede your business. It may be a security breach or potential security breach that's never mitigated. There's no compensating control because the solutions are just too hard, right? They also tend to be expensive. You're relying on traditional carriers to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you to provide that VPN type capability and segmentation. So you're going to an NTT or an AT&T or a Verizon or a CenturyLink or whoever it may be, and they're providing all that for you, which is great, except if you've dealt with the carriers, sometimes they're not always the most nimble. We talked about the ability to deploy, the ability to add VPNs, the ability to change things, often are not the easiest thing to do when we deal with carriers. And as we talk about different service offerings here, we will talk a little bit about carrier-supported SD-WAN versus, let's say, something that we might build and manage for you. They do all have their place, and it really depends on your particular use case. And I'll try to talk a little bit about where we think each of them fits and where different vendors might fit as we go through here. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what SD-WAN is. And to do that, you need a little background about, at a high level, about how it actually operates. So in a traditional routed environment, we basically do a routing protocol, and we route our traffic using the destination. So essentially, all the traffic goes the specific way based on where it's headed. Quite often, there's a primary connection. If that primary connection fails, we might send it somewhere else, but it's fairly limited, right? And certainly, work has been done with this. Cisco had an IWAN technology and IPSLA, but these kinds of overlays always tended to be complex and required quite a bit of expertise to actually deploy and use effectively. So what we are moving toward with an SD-WAN type solution is that a lot of the benefits actually come from having a single control plane or a single place to manage everything. Now, all the solutions that we're going to talk about today, for the most part, have a single pane of glass from a management perspective. And there are a number of vendors in this space, but for the most part, that's one of the benefits of SD-WAN. And that allows you to have these more complex policies where I might want to send voice and video traffic down an MPLS path where I have a guaranteed SLA, but I may have bulk file transfers and updates that I want to send over the internet. And I can easily provide that kind of pathing information. I can easily have encryption that I trust to go over the internet. And I can control all that from one place without having to touch 10 or 20 or 100 or 400 or 500 endpoints to make that all work. So we can treat all of that as one aggregate pipe, and it's carrier agnostic. So what do I mean by carrier agnostic? It could be an MPLS provider where I get an SLA. It could be an internet that's much cheaper where I get much more bandwidth. It could be a cable modem or cellular connection that I got because I could get that deployed in a matter of days or even hours as opposed to a matter of weeks or months. You have a lot of flexibility here as far as how you transport that network across the environment, across the internet, across the MPLS back into your hub or other locations that you have in your environment. And this will be kind of key when we talk about whether we do carrier services, which we do offer, and we can help you provision that, and your own kind of, either we manage it or you manage a type of service, whether you need that kind of flexibility, whether you need that kind of rapid agility, will help you determine whether a carrier-based service or whether more of a carousel managed or your own managed service is appropriate. So some of that probably seems like common sense, but we'll talk a little bit more about this. One of the things that's changed is we can monitor these types of circuits now, not just for the hard downs, but we can also look at things like jitter, delay, latency, for brownout type conditions. And where some of the cost savings come in from an SD-WAN perspective is we have customers that traditionally might have had an MPLS or two MPLS circuits, now have an MPLS and an internet, or potentially just two internets. Because now we can monitor the quality of that internet connection to see if there's reasonable jitter for doing voice traffic, if the delay is low enough, are we hitting our target SLAs on a connection, and if we're not, we can move it to a different internet connection. As long as I don't have poor quality on multiple circuits, multiple providers at the same time, I often have, and what's interesting about this is that we talked about that single pane of glass, kind of jumping ahead here, but one of the things you get in the single pane of glass in most of these solutions, again, is reporting and analytics. And what we've actually found is that in many cases, the internet-based solutions in major developed countries, I'll throw that caveat there, but let's say in the United States, actually performs better than the much more expensive MPLS circuits from a delay and latency perspective, and some cases, and jitter in a lot of cases as well. It's kind of an interesting transition that we've seen, and you can actually see those statistics come up to you as you run this solution. So we've had a lot of customers now that have gone with the MPLS and internet route, really starting to look at the statistics they're getting out of it, and probably, except in certain rare cases where they're doing, where voice is their business, like a call center, moving a lot of that traffic to dual internet. So again, a lot of flexibility, a lot of ability to pick and choose here, and the ability to do this all from one place, a lot of control, a lot of choices. So again, single pane of glass. I've kind of emphasized why that's important as we've gone through that. It could be, it allows you to manage these kinds of complex solutions in one place, one policy, push it out. It doesn't matter whether I have 3 locations or 500 locations. I create the policy, I push the policy is applied. Do I want to know, from an analytics perspective, is my provider in Europe performing well? I have 2 providers in the U.S. Is one better than the other? All those types of analytics work are available to you. And we do have a question here about whether these kinds of analytics are available for direct internet access or broadband. And again, the analytics and statistics are available regardless of transport. Now obviously if you're running over a cellular broadband type of connection, the latency is going to be really high and the numbers may not be great. But the system can use pretty much any transport that can do IP, and it will provide that kind of visibility, and it will provide that monitoring. What is the threshold that you want to hit, and if you don't hit those thresholds, we can fail over. I'm going to back up just a second and talk one more time really quickly about that single pane of glass, because I think it is kind of underestimated sometimes that this is actually one of the big advantages you get, not only from that policy deployment, but also from a control and audit. And I know I mentioned this before, but I think it is kind of important to emphasize what are the advantages of SD-WAN, why are people really doing it. So if I need to determine, for example, if I have a segment for PCI, and I need to be able to prove it only goes to these 5 stores, and it only comes out these, these specific 802.1 Q tags at these locations, I can do that in one place now. So when my auditor comes in, I don't have to go out and I don't have to pull config files from like 400 routers to try to prove where something goes now. Again, this may not apply to you, but for certain customers that are listening in right now, that may end up being the single most important aspect of SD-WAN, of an SD-WAN solution to you. So I'll cruise along here and we'll talk a little bit about cloud access. This is another thing that traditionally was very difficult in a traditional routed environment. We have infrastructure as a service, software as a service here. That's IaaS and SaaS. So I'll start with the left, infrastructure as a service. Many of you are probably already started down this path where you have at least some stuff moving up to AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. I think we're on the mainstream cycle now, if you're familiar with the hype cycle, where it takes off, everyone thinks it's going to take over the world, and then we kind of go through a period of disillusionment where I think people realize that the cloud stuff was actually just as complicated. Your routing ended up being just as complicated. It actually ended up costing more in many cases, and we had a lot of disillusionment. But now I think we're coming back around. People understand that it is useful. You just have to have the right use case. You have to know how to use it, where to use it, and you're starting to see that what I'll call effective migration into the cloud starting to occur in a lot of organizations. And you may not see this quite yet in your organization, or you may be well down the path, but it is obviously a trend in the industry. I'm sure that even if you haven't done this, it's something that you've heard and talked about. So how does SD-WAN fit into this? I can throw an SD-WAN node into the cloud. If I have private networks up in the cloud that I want to tie back into my facilities, and I don't want them to use, be exposed to the internet, I can tie that to all my office locations using SD-WAN. The cloud essentially just becomes another node in the SD-WAN fabric. I can have certain segments and certain offices go to certain parts of the cloud. I can transport traffic between different regions in the cloud, which is surprisingly not that easy to do in some cases. If I have Amazon in the East, and then Amazon in the West, and Amazon in Europe, how does all that routing work? How do I determine what goes where? How do I tie those, the front-end data between all those locations together? This is actually something SD-WAN can kind of help simplify. There are obviously tools built into the cloud, but they're not as helpful as you start bringing in remote offices and lots of locations. The ability to bring the SD-WAN fabric into the cloud can make your connectivity much easier in some cases. On the software as a service side, the right side of this slide here, these are things like Office 365 or Skype for Business or Dropbox or Box, where the service itself lives on the internet, and the most efficient way to get there is to go out on the internet. So if you think about this, in a traditional environment, you might have had MPLS, but one of the advantages of SD-WAN is that you'd often put an internet connection in at a remote location, whether that's for primary or whether that's just as a backup. You're going to have an internet at the remote location. So since you have internet, this gives you additional options. For example, if I'm going to go to Office 365, it might make sense to go directly out to Office 365 from that remote location and not drag all that traffic through the MPLS network. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about some of the design considerations toward the end of the presentation, but you can pick and choose. For example, if you know that you want to drop off Office 365 traffic because you trust that, essentially, that it's always encrypted, it's always going to known locations, it really doesn't matter where it comes out of the network because it's always going to be in an SSL tunnel anyway, we can drop that out at a remote office and continue to tunnel all your internet traffic back to a head-end location for if you need malware detection, IPS, those sorts of things. The other thing that's possible is a lot of these solutions actually do offer IPS, malware prevention, all that sort of stuff in the remote box or the remote unit, because quite often you do have internet and that is something that people want to do and dump all their traffic. Now, manageability-wise, there's some pluses and minuses in that sort of design, and it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but again, kind of like with the transport stuff, there's a lot of flexibility in the SD-WAN solution to drop some stuff off locally in the internet, drag that back to somewhere, or pick and choose depending on what your specific use case is. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that as we go along here and get into some of the specifics of some deployment models. But again, a lot of flexibility here that we technically probably had in a traditional router, but it was just too hard to manage, right? Especially when you get to multiple locations. So with that, we're going to kind of get into the market and where it's coming from, where it's going, some of the market dynamics. I didn't see any other questions come in, but if you had any on the previous section, feel free to put that into the question section, and we'll try to address those at the end. And again, if you have questions, try to present them as they come up. We'll talk a little bit about market dynamics. So there are a lot of vendors in this space. If you're on this call, it's probably because you've heard the hype, or you've heard an article, or you've heard 20 articles in 20 online ads, in pop-ups here and there. Everyone's getting into this space. Everyone's being funded. There are a lot of niche players in here. There are a lot of players that used to have other solutions like Silver Peak, Riverbed. There are players like Viptela, some of the other players. There's some of the incumbent players like Juniper. Everyone's getting in this space, right? And what's kind of happened, we've had some major acquisitions here. Cisco has bought Viptela, and VeloCloud is purchased by VMware. And I don't want to say that this means anything in particular other than this, that when the big players like the VMwares and the Ciscos get into a market, it, in some ways, I kind of say legitimizes the market, right? I used to work at Cisco. Cisco generally does not interested in getting into a market that's not going to be at least $1 billion a year. So in that sense, it kind of makes people sometimes sit up and notice that, okay, this is a real thing now. It's kind of like when many years ago IBM started making the personal computer, right? All of a sudden people realized, oh, this might be a real thing. It might be a real business tool that might solve real problems that I have. So in the last year or two, you've seen a tremendous shift in the market from a lot of what I'll call these small startups that are essentially trying to make a name for themselves, either merge or get purchased by someone, and it's really validated the market, and it's really gotten into Gartner's attention. It's a whole market now, and you'll see if we look at where we are right now, of the vendors that are in here, we support most of the vendors that are in the upper part of this quadrant, but again, different use cases, different solutions make sense for different customers. So I don't want to get too far into the specifics of one vendor versus another. I will talk a little bit about the categories of different vendors, though, a little bit, just to kind of go through that. If we back up a little bit, some of the traditional vendors, like let's say a Cisco, obviously have a long history of routing, and they tend to do very well when we're dealing with a complex routing environment. Some of the solutions, let's say like a Cisco Meraki or Fortinet, come from more of a security background. If you're looking for primarily firewall features and direct internet access at the remote location, that might be a useful solution to you. Some of the vendors like a Silver Peak may have come at it from a WAN optimization background. And while maybe with the similar to Fortinet, their SD-WAN story, actually Silver Peak has a fairly good SD-WAN story, as you see from Gartner's example here, but they're really looking at it mainly from that background of an optimization perspective. And if you have a lot of high latency, low bandwidth international sites, maybe they're an attractive solution for you. So again, there's not really a one-size-fits-all. I think you'll see over time the bigger vendors like the Ciscos and the leaders like Silver Peak will have more and more of the features, and you'll have it'll be much easier to make a choice or go to one place and get an all-in-one solution. But the market is actually still kind of evolving in that sense. So if there are any questions on that, feel free to put them in the chat window. Otherwise, I'm going to move along here and talk a little bit about specifics from some of the issues that come up, when we're trying to design this. I will say that the rest of the presentation will probably be a little more technical, and we'll be diving into a little bit more about how things actually operate and some of the concerns. Obviously, this is not going to be a tutorial on how to do SD-WAN or anything along those lines. It's more some of the high-level stuff that you need to be concerned about or think about as we do a deployment. But just give you that little warning that if you're looking more for the market dynamics and positioning, we probably covered a lot of that, except maybe at the end when we do some of the question and answer. So talk a little bit about some of the design considerations. We talked a lot about that firewalling at the edge. right? One of the things I didn't talk about, for example, was that, we want to go to Office 365 and we want to drop that off at the edge. We can, with some of these solutions, for example, the Viptela, do fairly sophisticated monitoring, saying that, like, hey, my local internet is through some cable provider, but if I go through that local internet provider and I go to the head end, and that head end has a direct connection, a much faster connection, I might actually be faster sending my Office 365 traffic to a bigger site and letting it go out that way. Well, you can do a lot of that sophisticated monitoring and rerouting of traffic to the cloud, software as a service, but that has some implications on where you're firewalling and, for example, where your NAT is, network address translation, because the place where the traffic goes out is what you want a NAT to, because that controls where traffic comes back. So again, I'm not going to try to explain all the issues that are related to this in these examples, but one of the challenges that comes up when you're trying to deploy these solutions is, where does the NAT occur? Where are my firewalls going to be? At a smaller site, am I going to integrate the firewall into the box that's doing SD-WAN, or do I want to keep a separate firewall? If I'm keeping a separate firewall, am I moving NAT so I can do some of these advanced cloud software services? And what does that mean from a reconfiguration perspective on my firewalls? I probably need to rewrite my rules. I need to change my NAT settings. How is that going to work from a deployment and design perspective? And again, it's all stuff that we can help you with if you want assistance. But at a high level, they're all considerations that you have to make as you go into this and try to figure out how you're going to deploy it. So this does not come up too often, but most of these solutions are cloud managed, meaning that the actual control, that pane of glass that we're talking about that does both the audit and pushes out the policy, often lives somewhere out on the internet. It's not always the case. If you have an environment where internet access is essentially forbidden, it's entirely private network, it's all point-to-point, it's all MPLS, we can build that inside your data center and give you that point of control inside your data center. Again, it's not a common use case, but if you are that type of customer. The other thing that tends to come up here is that depending on the solution, for example, some of the Cisco Meraki solutions are not as good on MPLS sometimes. We have to do special designs because that solution expects internet access to be available on all the upstream ports. Your current MPLS design may not have internet available on MPLS. So again, little things like that from a design, how to get to the internet, where those exit points are, whether internet access is even a viable option, all will impact how your SD-WAN will be deployed and how it will be designed as we go through the process of building it for you or advising you how to build it. One of the other things I'm going to throw up here is, again, this is segmentation, and we are coming toward the end of this. We talked a little bit about going to the carrier and getting a VPN. That's traditionally how an MPLS network would work. We can, in an SD-WAN solution, provision that ourselves. So if I have multiple business units at a company and I want traffic for some business units to be separated from other business units. You may not have business units, you're saying, but you may do a lot of mergers and acquisitions. I may acquire a company, and I may need to transport that traffic back to a head-end data center, and I want to consolidate that data center, but they used a 10.0.1 address, or they used 10.1.1, and guess what? You used the 10.1.1. I need to be able to segment that traffic, but I want to share the transport, and I want to bring that together. Certainly you could go to like a Verizon or a CenturyLink and order multiple VPNs and have them sent on 802.1q trunks. But again, it comes back to that flexibility and how quickly they can do that. So we can do that very quickly in an SD-WAN solution where you're controlling the units or we're doing the management for you. Open a ticket, spin that up, get a new VPN put out to large, essentially every box in the network, if that's what's required, out a different interface or with a different 802.1 queue tag. All sorts of topologies are possible, full meshes, partial meshes, point-to-point, with any of these overlay VPNs. So before I get off of this subject, I know I beat up the carriers a little bit, so I do want to mention that we do sell, let me back up just one second. We do sell resell carrier services, and they are appropriate for some customers. Just like most managed carrier services. If your environment is relatively static, doesn't change a whole lot, and I've said this before, if you rely primarily on one carrier in your geographic area, they provide good coverage. You like having one bill, one person to deal with. A carrier-based solution might be good for you. The challenges of carrier solutions, we've kind of already talked about them. They tend not to be really nimble. If you need to do moves, adds, and changes, again, not an issue if you're not doing a lot of moves, adds, and changes. The other thing is that they tend, a lot of the benefits we talked about with SD-WAN are from the fact that they're transport agnostic, meaning I can pick any carrier that's best appropriate for that location. Going with a carrier-based solution often limits you to, they'll, in their interest, will want you to use them as the carrier. So again, it does work for some, it doesn't work for others. Other solutions, for example, where we provide equipment, it might be as simple as we help you design it, or we ship you the equipment and you figure it out. But middle ground is we actually do a managed service where we will do a lot of the up-down monitoring. If the circuit goes down at 3 in the morning, our NOC here, which is just down the hallway from me, get that alert, open a ticket with the carrier, maybe even get it fixed before you wake up in the morning. So you can get a managed service from us, have a little more of that flexibility, a little more of that agility. So a lot of options on a deployment perspective, services anywhere from just design to deployment to full management. So I know we covered a lot of stuff there, and it went through pretty quickly, but I didn't see a lot of questions come up, but I see that a lot of people haven't dropped off, so I want to thank you for that. That was kind of the overview, though. Go ahead.
Yeah, John, we had another question. So you kind of just spoke to this, right? Maybe at a high level, based on one of the questions I just saw, can you kind of elaborate on, sort of the pros and cons of, an all-carrier, type of model versus, a customer-owned and managed or, partner model? I know in some cases, the value of SD-WAN is being able to get that visibility and, ensure that, when things do fail, that traffic's rerouting. But, can you count on the carrier to police themselves in those situations if they're also providing that connectivity? So I'm just curious if you could maybe speak at a little more depth as to kind of the differences between some of those flavors, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a carrier person. I tend to, for those of you that have worked in networking in the wide area for a long time, probably have a love-hate relationship with many of the major carriers, and I try to be open-minded about this, but I'll be upfront with you that that's my background and where I come from, and I probably have some of that baggage in my opinion. So having said that, I do think that carrier options are useful for some people. And again, if you're not looking for a lot of moves, adds, and changes, they can deploy something for you. If they allow you to a good portal access where you can see the statistics yourself, you can see the monitoring yourself, you might be able to get a lot of this information that you're looking for. But at the end of the day, I think you're hitting on something there, Jason, that this is the fox watching the hen house kind of scenario, right, where, the carrier's providing the circuit and they're enforcing the SLA and they're managing the way things go. So, got a couple more questions coming in here now. We manage any SD-WAN solution? No, we do have some that we have professional services for that we do manage. There's some of the major vendors that are listed in there, like Cisco, Viptela, Cisco, Meraki, Riverbed, Silver. Well, we're not managing Silver Peak yet, but we probably will. So a lot of the vendors we talked about, we do have capabilities to do things around them, but again, this is kind of a case-by-case thing. I would talk to your carousel account managers about what we can do for you. Carrier managed services, we generally don't manage. Often they have their own NOC and their own ways of doing that, and that's bundled in with the service. So it's essentially already paid for. But that goes back to the fox watching the hen house kind of scenario. QoS, heavy voice. So one of the things with QoS is that we can, a heavy voice customer, I want to address that really quickly. There are a couple of ways to approach that, right? We have customers that are very successful running 2 internet connections or multiple internet transports, and then just monitoring the latency and jitter, are able to always have good voice quality, and people are fairly successful with that. If you want to have an SLA for your voice, because it's business critical and you're a call center, one of the things you can do with SD-WAN that we talked about earlier is that you can continue to use MPLS from a provider that offers that gold level class of service for your voice, but only send your voice down that path. Send all your other traffic through the cheaper internet pipe. And you can actually set this up to use the internet if the internet is providing better quality than the MPLS that you're paying for an SLA for. And I think what you'll find, as I alluded to earlier, is that you'll find that quite often that your internet pipe is actually just as good as the MPLS pipe. And that's particularly true in developed countries like the United States, Canada, Europe, and if you have the same provider for the internet at both ends of the pipe, right? So I have CenturyLink talking to CenturyLink over the internet. Yes, it's internet, but the reality is you're talking over that provider's, in this case, CenturyLink's network from one end to the other. So I don't want to rule that out. There are different ways we can design it where you can get the SLA through the provider, but it's also not unreasonable to have voice go over the internet today and have good call quality. And again, case by case, talk to your carousel account team, and they'd be happy to, engage us. There's like 2 or 3 of us. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to that, right? So, and this is, in my mind, I think sometimes a little bit of a misnomer, right? So we've always treated, especially as network architects and engineers, and that's my background as well, going way back, we've always treated voice as sort of the holy grail from a packet delivery perspective. I think one of the things that we're seeing, a couple things we're seeing happen, right? So we're all, regularly on our cell phones, and we all know how the call quality there is, right? So I think in some ways the user expectations are changing, but what actually is more difficult to deliver than voice is actually real-time interactive video. So with voice, like a G729 codec, which is a fairly common codec that's leveraged on voice systems, you can actually lose up to 5% of the packets as long as they're not all in consecutive order before the end user actually recognizes that there is some degradation of the call. And, so really when we look at things like heavily compressed voice and video where you lose, 0.01% of the packets, that becomes more problematic than the voice. So, to John's earlier point, we do have lots of customers that have gone down this path with SD-WAN in dual internet scenarios. The other thing really quick, and I don't want to belabor the point too long here, we could definitely get a follow-up conversation on this question, is we see some of the SD-WAN vendors are coming in with specific feature sets to address this. Right, so they might have features like packet replication where they're taking a voice and video call and actually duplicating it, sending over both circuits if it's deemed as that critical to the business, right? There's other technologies like forward error correction that we've seen in some of the voice codecs on the client side over time, as well as now being embedded to some of the SD-WAN solutions. So that's where you really start to get down into the weeds around which solution makes the most sense, right? If I'm running a call center, I'm going to care about how quickly that solution fails over. Like for instance, the Cisco Meraki, like the failover time, and that's going to be much slower than, maybe what I would get with Viptela or Fortinet SD-WAN or Silver Peak or something along those lines. So to John's earlier point, it really depends what you're trying to do, but there's definitely a lot of different things that you have in this SD-WAN world that you didn't have before that you can manipulate as it pertains to voice and video. Sorry, John, go ahead.
No, and I think that's a good point. Specifically, Silver Peak, and I think to some extent now we have some forward error correction in Cisco. There is fairly robust ability now to take errors or send traffic down multiple paths, and I think that's something that is kind of growing because what you're doing here is trading bandwidth for quality. You're sending more bits of data, more error correcting bits, or bits down multiple paths so you can reassemble the audio stream at the other end without introducing a whole lot of delay or jitter. So I think the technology is going to get to the point where I actually think that we're pretty close to the point where MPLS is not really going to be a huge value to a lot of people unless they really just want that ability to go back to someone and say, you didn't meet your SLA, I'm not going to pay. At the end of the day, that's really all you get from the carrier if they screw up, right? They still screw up, and you still have to deal with it. Moving that control back to your side and deciding which carrier to use may actually provide better overall quality and better overall experience than having someone else accountable for it, as odd as that may sound. I don't know the answer to this question about what SLAs we have on moves, adds, and changes for our NOC.
Yeah, John, I can jump in on that. Yeah, so there's different service levels depending on what you're looking for, but as it pertains to SD-WAN specifically, we are staffed 24/7 in our NOC as well as our backup NOC and even overseas to manage anything that might come up. So if you have a piece of hardware fail or a circuit fail, we can get on that. And then as far as the move add change goes, so if you have to move a location, so we have customers that are in certain verticals, if you will, that regularly move locations. Maybe it's merger and acquisition type of activity or things of that nature. It really just depends on what we're doing, right? Usually we're beholden to the carrier as far as getting bodies on site to add devices, remove devices, that sort of thing. That's something we can typically do rather quickly, depending on the specific service offering. But if you have additional questions on that, please reach out to your Carousel AE or SE, and we could definitely dig into that question for you. Hey, John, there's another question on here around WAN optimization. So you kind of talked about this earlier. We saw some of the WAN optimization vendors pivot into this SD-WAN space. It seems like SD-WAN's like the big thing. WAN optimization isn't as much anymore as maybe it used to be, but we still see use cases for that in our customer base. Maybe you could, I know you briefly touched on it earlier, maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit more so that people get a feel for that difference between the two solutions, if you will.
So yes, some of this I blame Gartner for. They put one of the SD-WAN vendors in the top of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Was also a WAN optimization vendor, and that's kind of put WAN optimization back into center stage. To be honest, before that had happened, WAN optimization for the most part was on the decline and wane. And the reason for that is that WAN optimization really primarily helps you where you either have low bandwidth, extremely poor quality connection, or very high latency. Now, in the developed world, now barring some long distance high latency connections like going to Australia or Singapore or something like that, in the developed world, bandwidth is usually not an issue. Quality connection is not usually an issue. Latency might be an issue if you have really bad apps, but no matter what you do, your app is still going to be bad. Having said that, are there places in the world where bandwidth is still hard to get, where quality of connection is still questionable? I have customers that try to do call centers in the Philippines because they speak English and it's really cheap over there. But every time it rains, their circuits go all over the place. So yeah, it does still happen. And WAN optimization, I think, still does have a place. But again, like a lot of the other things that we talked about, it's not necessarily an all or nothing solution. And it often doesn't fit in a lot of places. Like we have a customer right now looking at multiple locations in the United States that are connected by gigabit point-to-point. WAN optimization is not going to help them, right? They don't have enough latency and they have too much bandwidth. We'll spend more time hashing the data and trying to find duplicate data than it would actually take to send it down the gigabit pipe. You know, you might be a completely different customer though, where you have like 8 locations in Vietnam, where you're lucky to get like a megabit per second out of a location. WAN optimization might be a good fit for you. I don't know if that really, does that kind of make sense, Jason?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think to recap, like everything, John, it depends.
Right. Yes, it does. And I guess that's one of the things I wanted to say is that there are a lot of, SD-WAN is a toolkit. It gives you the ability to do a lot of things. What you need to do for your specific situation is going to vary a lot. So, you know, and again, we can help you with that from a design perspective. If you know what you want, we can sell you the stuff. We can manage it however you want to go. If there are no other questions, though, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Dave. It's kind of interesting. We're coming up on the last couple of minutes, and I always think that we only have like 10 or 15 minutes of stuff to talk about, but when the questions start coming in, it always seems to manage to fill the hour, which still surprises me after all the times of doing this. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And again, if there are any other questions, you know, we'll be on for another minute or two, try to post them. And Dave, if you want to try to wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining our second session of Carousel's monthly Always On Virtual series. Shortly after we wrap, you will receive a brief survey requesting your input on today's session, as well as your interest in future topics. As a thank you for taking the time to complete the survey, we will send you a Starbucks gift card so your next cup of joe is on us. Next month, we will be joined by Carousel's UC Principal Consultant, John Vosberg, to discuss Unified Communications as a Service. Thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks, David. So we did have another question come in, John. And since we do have a full 8 minutes left, and I don't have to get on another call, I think it's a good one worth answering. I might have walked into this one. So the question is, in failover solution, or failover situations, which vendor is the fast in reconnecting or reconverging? And again, it depends, right? It depends on the feature sets that are being enabled, the number of transports. From our experience, some of the players that, like a Riverbed or maybe a Meraki or a Fortinet, where they're more security-centric, you tend to have slower failover with some of those solutions versus sort of the pure play SD-WAN players like a Viptela or VeloCloud or even Silver Peak. And so it's again one of those conversations that we'd love to have with you to kind of talk through, based on your requirements, what makes the most sense there, when it comes to reconvergence. But it's something that's extremely critical, right? A lot of times in the network world, we think about looking for that sub-second failover scenario, and some of the products don't actually support that. So it's definitely something worth digging into. Go ahead, John.
I will throw one other thing out there that I might rephrase the question a little bit in the sense that the convergence thing might not matter because some of the players like Silver Peak and Cisco in particular have some ability to mask failures by doing either the forward error correction or replication of packets. And in those cases, those are probably the best case scenario in the sense that you won't even see a failure, right? There is no reconvergence because the remote unit is actually regenerating the data either from the forward error correction bits or from the duplicate stream. So, again, it really depends on what as Jason was saying, is reliability so important for you that you can afford to send the data twice? And is bandwidth so cheap at those locations that makes sense? For some people, the answer is yes, right? Again, every situation is going to be a little different.
All right. Well, thank you everyone again, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everyone.